Some people say love starts with a glance across a crowded room, but mine started with a napkin that could have gotten me killed. If you're watching this from a place where you feel safe and secure, where the biggest danger in your life is running late for work or forgetting to pay a bill, I want you to comment below and tell me what state you're from, because I'm about to tell you about the night my safe little world exploded into something I never could have imagined. The Velvet Room was the kind of upscale Chicago lounge where people paid $30 for a cocktail and pretended the money didn't matter. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over leather booths filled with men in $1,000 suits and women who looked like they'd stepped out of fashion magazines. I've been bartending here for 8 months, and I still felt like an imposter every time I walked through those mahogany doors. My name is Sofia Martinez, and at 24, I was doing everything I could to stay invisible. The tips at Velvet Room were keeping me afloat while I finished nursing school, but barely. Between tuition payments and helping my younger sister Lily with her college expenses, I was always one emergency away from disaster. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was studying to save lives while serving drinks to people who probably had more money in their wallets than I made in a month. That Thursday night started like any other. October wind rattled the windows while I polished glasses and tried not to think about the pharmacology exam I had the next morning. The lounge was busy but not packed, the usual mix of business deals and expensive dates playing out in the dim lighting. I'd learned to read the room over the months working here, to spot which tables were closing million-dollar deals and which were ending relationships. It was a skill that came in handy for timing drink refills and avoiding awkward moments. I was restocking the top-shelf vodka when he walked in. He moved like he owned not just the room, but the entire building, maybe the whole block. Tall, probably 6 foot whoa, with dark hair styled in that effortlessly perfect way that suggested an expensive barber. His suit was charcoal gray and fit him like it had been made specifically for his broad shoulders. But it was his eyes that made me look twice, a striking green-gray that seemed to take in everything and everyone with a single sweep of the room. He couldn't have been much older than 35, but there was something in the way he carried himself that suggested he'd seen more of the world than most people twice his age. When he smiled at the hostess, it was polite but didn't reach those distinctive eyes. Power radiated from him in a way that made other patrons unconsciously step aside as he followed her to a corner booth. I forced myself to look away and focus on my work. In places like Velvet Room, staring at the clientele was a quick way to lose your job. These people valued their privacy, and I value my paycheck. But I found my gaze drifting back to him throughout the evening as he sat alone, checking his phone and occasionally glancing toward the entrance like he was waiting for someone. Around 10:30, 3 men arrived and joined him at the booth. I couldn't hear their conversation from behind the bar, but their body language spoke volumes. This wasn't a friendly reunion. The newcomers sat stiffly, their voices low and urgent when they leaned in to speak. The original man, the one who'd caught my attention, listened more than he talked, his expression neutral but alert. I was mixing a Manhattan for table 6 when I overheard something that made my blood run cold. The kitchen staff at Velvet Room weren't known for their discretion, especially after they'd been sampling the cooking wine. Marco, one of the prep cooks, was talking to Tommy, the dishwasher, near the service window that separated the bar from the kitchen. Their voices carried in the way voices do when people think no one important is listening. Something about a special addition to a drink order. Something that would make sure the guy at table 12 didn't make it to his car tonight. The way Marco said it, with a nervous laugh that held no humor, made it clear this wasn't a joke about adding extra olives to a martini. Table 12. The corner booth. The man with the green-gray eyes. My hand started shaking as I finished the Manhattan, the reality of what I'd overheard sinking in. Someone was going to poison him. Right here, in the lounge where I worked, where I needed to keep working if I wanted to graduate nursing school and build the kind of life I'd dreamed about since I was Lily's age. The smart thing would be to keep my head down and pretend I hadn't heard anything. I was nobody, just a bartender trying to pay her bills and stay out of trouble. Whatever was happening at table 12 was way above my pay grade and probably way beyond my ability to understand. These people moved in circles I couldn't even imagine, dealing with problems I'd only seen in movies. But as I watched him sitting there, completely unaware that his next drink might be his last, something inside me rebelled against the idea of doing nothing. Maybe it was all those years of studying to be a nurse, training myself to help people when they were in danger. Maybe it was just basic human decency. Or maybe it was something about the way he'd smiled at the hostess, polite even when he was clearly dealing with serious business. I grabbed a cocktail napkin and a pen, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the lounge could hear it. The words came without conscious thought, my handwriting shakier than usual as adrenaline flooded my system. Don't drink it. Act normal and leave. I stared at the napkin for a long moment, knowing that the smart choice was to throw it away and forget I'd ever heard Marco's conversation. Once I handed over this warning, there would be no going back. I'd be involved in whatever dangerous game was being played at table 12, whether I wanted to be or not. But the alternative was standing by and watching someone die. I folded the napkin carefully and slipped it into my apron pocket. The next few minutes felt like hours as I waited for the right moment. The men at his table were deep in conversation, their attention focused on documents one of them had spread across the surface. Kitchen staff moved in and out of view, and I knew it was only a matter of time before that doctored drink made its way to the bar for delivery. When the man with the green-gray eyes glanced up and made eye contact, I moved. Walking across the lounge felt like crossing a minefield. Every step echoed in my ears. Every breath felt too loud. I approached the table with a professional smile, the kind I'd perfected for dealing with demanding customers and complicated orders. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need to refresh your drinks." The napkin was in my hand, concealed beneath the small tray I carried for appearances. He looked up at me fully for the first time, and I felt the impact of his direct attention like a physical force. Up close, his eyes were even more striking, and there was an intelligence there that suggested he missed very little. When our fingers brushed as I slipped him the napkin, I felt an unexpected jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the dangerous situation we were both in. For a moment that stretched between us like a held breath, I thought he might ignore the warning. He glanced down at the folded napkin, then back up at me, and I saw the exact moment he processed what was happening. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind those remarkable eyes. Instead of the discreet exit I'd expected, he did something that changed both our lives forever. He reached out and grabbed my hand, not roughly, but with unmistakable intent, his fingers closing around my wrist as he stood from the booth in one fluid motion. The men he'd been meeting with looked up in surprise, their conversation cutting off mid-sentence. "We need to go," he said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Now, I opened my mouth to protest, to explain that I'd just been trying to help, that I had a job to finish and an exam to study for, and a life that didn't include whatever this was. But the sound of raised voices from the kitchen area made the words die in my throat. Someone had discovered something, and from the anger in those voices, it wasn't good news for either of us. His hand was warm and steady around mine as he guided me away from the table, moving with the kind of calm urgency that suggested this wasn't his first time leaving a dangerous situation. The other men at the booth were standing now too, their faces grim as they followed our path across the lounge. I could hear my manager calling my name from behind the bar, confusion and irritation clear in his voice. In a few hours, I'd probably be unemployed. In a few minutes, I might be dead. But as the man with the green-gray eyes led me toward the back exit, his thumb brushing reassuringly across my knuckles, I realized that some choices change everything whether you're ready or not. The last thing I saw before we pushed through the exit door was Marco emerging from the kitchen, his face pale with panic as he scanned the lounge for his intended target. The man who was supposed to die tonight was walking out alive, and I was walking out with him. Behind us, chaos was beginning to erupt as people realized something had gone very wrong with someone's very dangerous plan. The alley behind Velvet Room was dark and narrow, filled with dumpsters and the kind of shadows that made smart people walk faster. But the man whose hand was still wrapped around mine moved through it like he owned every inch of Chicago his steps confident despite the chaos we'd just fled. A sleek black sedan waited at the far end of the alley, engine running. I barely had time to register the driver behind the wheel before my rescuer was pulling open the passenger door and guiding me inside with a hand on my lower back. "Get in," he said, and there was something in his voice that made arguments seem pointless. The leather seats were warm and soft, the kind of luxury I'd only experienced in movies. But comfort was the last thing on my mind as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I just walked away from my job, possibly forever, with a man I didn't know, because I'd overheard something that sounded like a murder plot. What was I thinking? He slid into the seat beside me and nodded to the driver, an older man with graying hair and alert eyes that kept checking the rearview mirror. We pulled out of the alley smoothly, merging into Chicago traffic like we were just another car on another Thursday night. Except we weren't. "Are we being followed?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. The question felt surreal, like something out of a movie rather than my actual life. He was watching the side mirror, his profile sharp in the glow of streetlights as we passed. "Not yet," he said, "but they'll figure out what happened soon enough." The casual way he said it made my stomach clench. They, as in multiple people who wanted him dead, who were probably now looking for both of us. I pressed my palms against my thighs, trying to stop my hand from shaking. "I'm Dante Romano," he said, turning to look at me fully for the first time since we'd left the lounge. "And you just saved my life." "Sophia Martinez," I replied automatically, then immediately wondered if I should have given him a fake name. But it was too late now, and something about his steady green-gray eyes made lying seem both impossible and unnecessary. "Sophia," he repeated like he was testing how my name felt in his voice. That was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, what you did back there. Probably stupid, I admitted, watching the familiar streets of my neighborhood disappear behind us as we headed toward downtown. I don't even know what I was thinking. I just heard them talking about putting something in your drink, and I couldn't just stand there and watch someone get poisoned. He was quiet for a moment, studying my face in the dim light from the dashboard. "Most people would have minded their own business," he said finally, "kept their heads down and stayed out of trouble that wasn't theirs to begin with." "Maybe I should have," I said, the full weight of my situation starting to hit me. "Oh God, I just walked down my job. I have bills, I have school, I have a sister who depends on me. I can't afford to lose that job." The panic was building in my chest, making it hard to breathe properly. Everything I'd worked for over the past 2 years, all my carefully laid plans for finishing nursing school and building a stable life, had just gone up in smoke because I couldn't mind my own business. "Sophia," Dante said, his voice gentle but firm. "Look at me." I turned toward him, trying to focus on his face instead of the catastrophic spiral my thoughts were taking. "You can't go back there," he continued. "Once they realize what happened, once they figure out you're the one who warned me, that place won't be safe for you. Neither will your apartment, or your school, or anywhere else you normally go." The words hit me like cold water. I'd been so focused on the immediate danger in the lounge that I hadn't thought about the aftermath, about the fact that helping him might have painted a target on my own back. "What are you saying?" I whispered. "I'm saying that as of tonight, your old life is on hold," he said. "The people who tried to kill me don't leave loose ends, and you just became a very big loose end." We were driving through downtown now, past buildings that gleamed with late-night office lights and restaurants where people were finishing dinner and planning their normal, safe tomorrows. I wanted to be one of those people, wanted to rewind the last hour and choose differently, choose to mind my own business and finish my shift and go home to study for my pharmacology exam. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I found myself looking at Dante's profile and feeling something that had nothing to do with regret. There was strength in the set of his jaw, intelligence in the way his eyes tracked movement on the street, and something almost protective in the way he'd positioned himself between me and the door. When he'd taken my hand in the lounge, when he'd guided me out of danger, it had felt less like being dragged into trouble and more like being rescued from it. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere they can't reach you while we figure out what happens next." The building we pulled up to was glass and steel, reaching toward the Chicago sky like a gleaming finger. The kind of place where penthouses cost more than most people made in a lifetime. Security guards in expensive suits nodded respectfully as we passed through the lobby, and I caught a glimpse of marble floors and crystal chandeliers before we stepped into an elevator that required a special key card to operate. "You live here?" I asked as we rode up in silence. "One of the places I stay," he said, which told me nothing and everything at the same time. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse that took my breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the Chicago skyline in all its glittering glory, while the interior was all clean lines and expensive furniture arranged with an eye for both comfort and style. It was beautiful, sophisticated, and completely intimidating to someone who lived in a studio apartment with a bathroom so small you had to step into the shower to close the door. "This is where you want me to stay?" I asked, feeling more out of place than I had even at Velvet Room. "This is where you'll be safe," Dante said, setting his keys on a table that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "The building has excellent security, and my people know to watch for anything unusual." "Your people," I repeated. "Who exactly are your people, Dante?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing how much truth to give me. Finally, he walked to the windows and gestured for me to join him there. "The Torino family has been trying to muscle in on territory that's been ours for 3 generations, he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Tonight was supposed to end that conflict permanently, with my death making their takeover easier." "Territory," I said slowly. "What kind of territory?" He turned to face me, and I could see him making the decision to be completely honest. The kind that involves businesses and protection and things your nursing school probably didn't cover in their ethics classes. The reality of who he was, what he was, settled over me like a heavy blanket. Mafia. Organized crime. The kind of man my mother had warned me about, the kind of trouble smart girls avoided. Except I was standing in his penthouse, under his protection, because I'd chosen to save his life. I should be terrified, I thought. I should be demanding to go home. Consequences be damned. Instead, I found myself studying his face, looking for signs of the violence and cruelty I'd always associated with his world. What I saw instead was a man who'd treated me with more genuine care in the past hour than my last boyfriend had shown in 6 months. "Your sister," he said, apparently reading my mind. "Lily, right? You mentioned her on the phone at the bar. How do you know about Lily?" I asked, alarm making my voice sharp. "I pay attention," he said, "and I heard you trying to cover for your absence when your manager called you over earlier. She's important to you." "She's everything to me," I said without thinking. "Our parents died in a car accident when she was 14. I'm all the family she has left. Which is why," Dante continued gently, "you need to understand that this isn't just about your safety anymore. If the Torinos figure out who you are, if they decide to use you to get to me, Lily becomes a target too." The words hit me like a physical blow. In trying to save his life, I'd potentially endangered the one person I couldn't bear to lose. The sister who trusted me to keep her safe, who was counting on me to help her through college the same way I was struggling through nursing school. "I need to call her," I said, panic making my voice tight. "I need to warn her. I need to make sure she's okay." "You can call her," Dante said, "but you can't tell her the truth. Not yet. The less she knows, the safer she is." He handed me his phone, a device that was probably worth more than my textbooks for the entire semester. As I dialed Lily's number, I caught him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was concern there, and something that might have been respect, but underneath it all was something warmer, something that made my pulse quicken despite everything else that was happening. The phone rang 3 times before Lily answered, her voice bright with the careless happiness of someone whose biggest worry was tomorrow's sociology quiz. "Sophie?" she said, using the nickname only she was allowed to use. "Why are you calling so late? Don't you have that big pharmacology exam tomorrow?" Hearing her voice, so normal and safe, and completely unaware of the danger that might be heading her way, made my throat tight with emotion. "I'm fine," I said, forcing my voice to sound casual. "I just wanted to check in. How was your day?" As Lily chattered about her classes and her roommate's latest drama, I watched Dante move around the penthouse, making phone calls of his own in a voice too low for me to overhear. He'd shed his suit jacket, and I found myself noticing the way his dress shirt stretched across his shoulders, the easy confidence with which he commanded whatever conversation he was having. This was insane. I was attracted to him. Here I was, my entire life turned upside down, hiding from people who want to kill us both, and part of my brain was cataloging the way his dark hair fell across his forehead and wondering what it would feel like to run my fingers through it. "Sophie?" Lily was saying. "Are you even listening?" "Sorry," I said quickly. "I'm just tired. Listen, I might be out of touch for a few days. Work stuff. But I love you, okay?" "Love you too," she said. I could hear the slight confusion in her voice. But the call ended before she could ask questions I couldn't answer. "She's safe," Dante said, appearing at my elbow with a glass of something amber and strong-smelling. "I've had people watching her building since we left the lounge. If anyone shows interest in her, we'll know." "You were watching her before I even asked," I said, taking the drink but not tasting it yet. "I told you I pay attention," he replied. "The people you care about become my responsibility the moment you become mine to protect." The way he said it, like protecting me was a foregone conclusion rather than a favor, sent an unexpected warmth through my chest. When was the last time someone had taken care of me instead of the other way around? When had anyone made my safety their priority? "I don't understand any of this," I admitted, finally taking a sip of the drink. It burned pleasantly, some kind of expensive whiskey that tasted like smoke and honey. "I don't understand your world, or why helping you means I can't go home, or how my life got completely turned around in the space of an hour." Dante sat down beside me on the couch, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive that made me want to lean closer instead of pulling away. "I can't promise to make it simple," he said, "but I can promise to keep you safe while we figure out how to make this right. Trust me, Sophia." The smart answer would have been no. The smart answer would have been to demand he call the police, or find a way to get me into witness protection, or do anything other than asking me to trust a man I'd known for less than 2 hours. But when I looked into those remarkable green-gray eyes, when I felt the solid warmth of him beside me and remembered the gentle way he'd guided me out of danger, smart felt less important than the certainty that this man would keep his word. "Okay," I said, and watched something that might have been relief flicker across his features. "Okay," he repeated, like he was sealing a promise between us. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago glittered in the night, beautiful and distant, and suddenly feeling like someone else's city. Tomorrow I was supposed to take an exam that would determine whether I passed pharmacology. Next week I was supposed to work 4 shifts at Velvet Room to cover my portion of Lily's textbook expenses. Next month I was supposed to graduate and start looking for nursing positions at the kind of hospitals that help people heal from the violence that apparently surrounded men like Dante Romano. Instead, I was sitting in a penthouse with a man who'd admitted to being in organized crime, drinking whiskey that probably cost more than I made in a week, and feeling safer than I had in months. My old life was on hold, just like he'd said. But looking at Dante's profile as he made another quiet phone call, watching the careful way he moved to keep himself between me and the windows, I found myself wondering if maybe, just maybe, what came next might be worth the chaos it would take to get there. Waking up in a bed that wasn't mine, in a room that cost more than I'd see in 5 years, should have felt wrong. Instead, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the soft whisper of expensive sheets made me feel more rested than I had in months. For a moment, in that drowsy space between sleep and consciousness, I'd forgotten where I was and why. Then the smell of coffee and something that might have been bacon drifted through the air, and reality came flooding back. Dante Romano, the Torino family, the fact that my carefully ordered life had been completely derailed because I couldn't mind my own business. I'd slept in my clothes from the night before, too overwhelmed and uncertain to ask for anything else. The bathroom attached to the guest room was larger than my entire studio apartment, all marble and gold fixtures that gleamed under soft lighting. When I caught sight of myself in the mirror, I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who'd been through something traumatic and was trying to piece together what came next. The sound from the kitchen grew more distinct as I made my way through the penthouse, and I found myself moving quietly, like I was intruding on something private, which in a way I supposed I was. This was his home, his sanctuary, and I was a complication he'd taken on because I'd been brave or stupid enough to save his life. Dante stood at the stove with his back to me, dressed in dark jeans and a white t-shirt that clung to broad shoulders in a way that made my mouth go dry. Gone was the expensive suit and the aura of barely contained danger. In its place was something softer, more human, though no less compelling. His dark hair was slightly mussed, like he'd run his fingers through it, and there was something almost domestic about the way he moved around the kitchen. The sight of him cooking breakfast, handling pans and spatulas with the same confident efficiency he'd shown when guiding me out of danger, was so unexpected that I stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, just watching. "Good morning," he said without turning around, apparently sensing my presence. "Coffee's fresh, and I hope you like your eggs over easy." "You cook?" I said, the observation coming out more surprised than I'd intended. He glanced over his shoulder with a smile that transformed his entire face, erasing the hard edges I'd seen the night before and replacing them with something warm and almost boyish. "My mother would have disowned me if I'd grown up unable to feed myself," he said. "See, you look like you could use some fuel." The kitchen island was set for two, with plates and silverware arranged on placemats that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. But it was the small details that caught my attention. The way he'd folded the napkins, the fresh orange juice poured into glasses that caught the morning light, the single white rose in a small vase between our places. "You didn't have to do all this," I said, sliding onto one of the bar stools and accepting the cup of coffee he handed me. It was perfect cream and just a touch of sugar, exactly how I liked it, though I'd never told him my preference. "I wanted to," he said simply, and something about the way he said it made warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. As he plated eggs and bacon with the kind of care usually reserved for restaurant presentation, I found myself studying his face in the morning light. There were small lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter, and a thin scar along his left temple that I hadn't noticed in the dim lighting of the lounge. His hands, which had felt so steady and sure when they'd guided me to safety, moved with surprising gentleness as he set my plate in front of me. "This is incredible," I said after taking my first bite. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My nana," he said, settling onto the stool beside me with his own plate. She believed that food was love, and that any man who couldn't show love through cooking wasn't worth much. I spent summers in her kitchen learning that the secret to perfect eggs is patience and the right temperature. There was something in his voice when he mentioned his grandmother, a softness that made me want to know more. But before I could ask, he was turning the conversation back to me. "What about you?" he asked. "What's your story, Sophia Martinez?" The question should have been simple, but sitting across from him in the morning light, sharing breakfast like we were friends instead of strangers thrown together by circumstances, made me want to give him more than the surface details I usually shared with people. "Not much of a story," I said, taking another bite to buy myself time. "Parents died when I was 20 and Lily was 14. I've been planning to travel after college, maybe see Europe, figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Instead, I became a guardian and realized that nursing school was the fastest way to a stable income that would let me take care of both of us." "That's not a small story," Dante said quietly. "That's a story about sacrifice and love and doing what needs to be done even when it's hard. Your sister is lucky to have you." The sincerity in his voice made my throat tight with unexpected emotion. Most people, when they heard about my situation, responded with pity or awkward sympathy. Dante spoke like he understood the weight of responsibility, like he knew what it meant to put someone else's needs before your own dreams. "What about you?" I asked, deflecting attention from emotions I wasn't ready to examine. "What's your story?" Something shuddered behind his eyes, but he didn't avoid the question the way I'd expected. "My father built an empire," he said. "When he died, I inherited it along with all the enemies and obligations that came with it. Not exactly the career path I'd planned, but family is family." "What'd you planned?" I found myself asking, leaning forward slightly without realizing it. "Law school," he said with a rueful smile. I wanted to be the Romano who helped people instead of the one they needed help hiding from. Ironic, considering where we are now. The admission was so unexpected, so at odds with everything I thought I knew about men and his world, that I could only stare at him. In the space of 12 hours, this man had gone from dangerous stranger to protector to someone who'd wanted to help people through the legal system. Life rarely goes according to plan, I said finally. No, he agreed, his green-gray eyes meeting mine across the small space between us. It doesn't. But sometimes the detours turn out to be more interesting than the original destination. There was something in the way he looked at me when he said it that made my pulse quicken, like he was talking about more than just career changes and family obligations. Before I could analyze the feeling too deeply, he was standing and clearing our plates with the same efficient care he'd shown in cooking. "Come on," he said. "Let me show you around properly. If you're going to be staying here, you should know where everything is." The tour that followed revealed layers to both the penthouse and its owner that I hadn't expected. Beyond the obvious luxury were personal touches that spoke to interests and depth I wouldn't have anticipated. Books filled built-in shelves in what he called his office. Volumes on everything from Roman history to modern architecture to contemporary literature. Art hung on the walls. Not the generic expensive pieces I'd expected, but carefully chosen works that showed both sophistication and personal taste. "You read Neruda," I said, stopping in front of one bookshelf and running my finger along the spine of a worn volume of poetry. "In the original Spanish," he said, appearing beside me with a slight smile. My mother was Chilean. She insisted I understand both sides of my heritage. The casual mention of his mother, combined with the well-loved appearance of the book, painted a picture of a childhood that was more complex than I'd imagined. This wasn't just a man who'd been born into violence and power. This was someone who'd been raised with culture and education, who'd been loved enough that his grandmother taught him to cook and his mother made sure he understood poetry. In a living area, floor-to-ceiling windows showcased Chicago spreading out below us like a glittering map. But it was the grand piano in the corner that caught my attention, its ebony surface gleaming in the afternoon light. "You play?" I asked. "Badly," he said with self-deprecating humor. But my mother insisted on lessons. She said music was the language of the soul, and that any cultured man should be able to speak it. The image of him at that piano, fingers moving over keys with the same careful precision he'd shown while cooking, sent an unexpected flutter of attraction through me. There are so many layers to him, so many contradictions between the dangerous world he inhabited and the thoughtful, educated man I was beginning to see. My phone buzzed, interrupting the moment, and I saw Lily's name on the screen. "Video call." "I should take this," I said, accepting the call before Dante could respond. Lily's face appeared on the screen, bright and animated in the way that only 19-year-olds manage to be even in the middle of a busy day. She was clearly in her dorm room, textbooks spread across the desk behind her. "Sophie," she said, her smile faltering slightly as she took in my appearance. "You look tired. Are you feeling okay?" "I'm fine," I lied, very aware that Dante had moved to give me privacy while staying close enough to hear if something went wrong. "Just been a long day at work." "It's barely noon," Lily said with the kind of logic that made lying to her nearly impossible. "And why does your background look different? Where are you?" I glanced around, realizing that the expensive penthouse setting behind me was definitely not what Lily would expect to see. "I'm at a friend's place," I said quickly. "Had to help with something work-related." Lily's expression grew more concerned rather than less. "Sophie, you're being weird. What's going on? You never stay over at friends' places, and you definitely never miss telling me about big work things." The urge to tell her everything, to explain about the danger and the impossibility of our situation, was almost overwhelming. But I could see Dante in my peripheral vision, could remember his warning about how the less she knew, the safer she would be. "Everything's fine," I said, forcing my voice to sound lighter. "I promise I'll explain everything soon. Okay? I just need a few days to sort some things out." We talked for a few more minutes, Lily chattering about her classes and her roommate's latest romantic drama, but I could see the worry in her eyes even as she maintained her cheerful demeanor. When the call ended, I felt the weight of lying to the one person I never kept secrets from. "She knows something's wrong," Dante said quietly. "She's always been able to read me too well," I admitted. "We've been taking care of each other for so long that we can usually tell when the other one is struggling." "It's temporary," he said, moving to sit beside me on the couch. "Once we resolve this situation with the Torinos, you can tell her everything." The casual way he said it made it sound simple, but I was beginning to understand that nothing about his world was ever simple. "What if we can't resolve it?" I asked. "What if this is just my life now?" "It won't be," he said with a certainty that I wanted desperately to believe. "I don't leave problems unsolved, Sophia. It's not good for business, and it's not who I am." Before I could ask what exactly that meant, his phone rang. The change in his demeanor was immediate and complete, the relaxed domestic version of him disappearing as he answered with the kind of authority I'd glimpsed in the car the night before. The conversation that followed was conducted in rapid Italian, his voice low and controlled, but with an edge that suggested whoever was on the other end was delivering news he didn't like. I couldn't understand the words, but I could read his body language, the way his free hand clenched into a fist, the tightness around his eyes. When he hung up, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city spread below us. "What is it?" I asked. "They found your apartment," he said finally. "Tore it apart looking for anything that might tell them where you've gone or who you might have talked to." The news hit me like a physical blow. My apartment, my safe space, violated by people who wanted to hurt me because I tried to help him. All my things, my books, my photos of Lily and our parents, the small treasures that made a studio apartment feel like home. "Did they find anything?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "Nothing useful," he said, "but they left a message. They want me to know they're serious about finding you." The implication hung in the air between us, heavy with the understanding that this wasn't going to be resolved quickly or easily. Whatever normal life I'd been clinging to was truly gone now, at least for the foreseeable future. "I'm sorry," Dante said, turning to look at me with an expression that was equal parts regret and determination. "I'm sorry the helping me cost you so much." The sincerity in his voice, the obvious weight he was carrying over my situation, made something shift in my chest. This man, who could command authority with a phone call and move through dangerous situations like they were routine, was genuinely troubled by the disruption to my life. "I made the choice," I said quietly. "No one forced me to warn you. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and I'd do it again, even knowing what it would cost you." The question hung between us, loaded with implications neither of us was quite ready to address. But looking at him in the afternoon light, seeing the concern in his remarkable eyes and the careful way he'd treated me since the moment I'd handed him that napkin, I realized my answer was simpler than it should have been. "Even knowing what it would cost me," I said. Something passed between us in that moment, an understanding that went deeper than the circumstances that had brought us together. When he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, the gesture was so gentle and unexpected that I felt my breath catch. "You save people," he said softly, his fingers still lingering near my face. "That's who you are. You become a nurse. You risk your life for a stranger. You sacrifice your dreams to take care of your sister. And you?" I asked, very aware of how close he was, how the space between us seemed charged with possibilities I wasn't ready to name. "I destroy them," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been self-recrimination. "I'm the reason you can't go home, the reason your life is in danger. But you're also the reason I'm safe," I said, surprising myself with the words. "You could have walked away last night. You could have let me deal with the consequences of my choice alone. Instead, you brought me here. You're protecting me. You made me breakfast and show me your grandmother's poetry books." The distance between us had shrunk to nothing, his hand now cupping my cheek with a tenderness that made my heart race. When he looked at me like that, like I was something precious and unexpected, it was easy to forget about the danger, about the impossibility of our situation, about every rational reason why this was a terrible idea. "Sophia," he said, my name barely a whisper on his lips. The security alert that shattered the moment was sharp and insistent, a sound that had Dante on his feet and moving toward a panel by the door before I could even process what was happening. His entire demeanor changed again, the gentle man who'd been about to kiss me disappearing behind the mask of someone who lived with constant threats. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding for entirely different reasons now. "Motion sensors on the lower level," he said, checking what appeared to be a security feed on his phone. "Probably nothing, but we don't take chances." The next few minutes passed in tense silence as he made phone calls and checked systems I didn't understand. I found myself studying his profile, watching the way he moved with lethal grace, even while investigating what would turn out to be a false alarm triggered by a maintenance worker who'd forgotten to check in with security. When he finally relaxed, turning back to me with an apologetic smile, the moment between us had passed. But something had changed in that almost kiss, in the way we'd looked at each other, in the admission that we were both attracted despite every rational reason to keep our distance. "All clear," he said, settling back onto the couch, but maintaining careful distance between us. "Good," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure if I was talking about the security alert or the fact that we'd been interrupted before we could make a mistake we weren't ready for. But as the afternoon stretched into evening, as we ordered Chinese takeout and talked about books and places we'd traveled and dreams we'd set aside, I found myself stealing glances at his mouth and wondering what might have happened if that alarm hadn't sounded. The attraction was there, undeniable and growing stronger with every hour we spent together. But underneath, it was something that felt more dangerous than any external threat. The possibility that this forced proximity might become something neither of us had planned for, something that would complicate an already impossible situation, something that might be worth the complications. The morning news shattered what little peace I'd managed to find in our temporary sanctuary. I was making coffee in Dante's kitchen, trying to establish some kind of routine in a situation that felt completely unmoored from reality, when the anchor's voice caught my attention. A shooting at an upscale Chicago lounge. 2 dead, 3 injured. Police investigating what appeared to be a targeted attack on prominent businessman Vincent Torino. My hand started shaking before my brain fully processed what I was hearing. Vincent Torino, the lounge. The night that had started with me serving drinks and ended with my entire world exploding. The images on the screen were worse than anything my imagination had conjured. Crime scene tape, ambulances, the familiar facade of Velvet Room, now scarred with bullet holes and broken glass. Police officers interviewing staff members I recognized, people I'd worked alongside for months, their faces pale with shock and fear. Dante appeared beside me, drawn by the sound of the television, his expression grim as he took in the news coverage. One of the injured, the anchor was saying, was a kitchen employee who'd been found beaten in the alley behind the building. A warning, police believed, though they weren't releasing details about what information the attackers had been seeking. "Marco," I whispered, recognizing the name they mentioned. "He has 2 kids. His wife is pregnant with their 3rd. The coffee mug slipped from my numb fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of ceramic and dark liquid. I stared at the mess, overwhelmed by the realization that real people had been hurt, that my decision to save Dante's life had set in motion a chain of violence that reached far beyond the 2 of us. "This is my fault," I said, the words coming out barely above a whisper. "Those people got hurt because I warned you, because I couldn't mind my own business." Dante's hands were on my shoulders, firm and warm, turning me away from the television screen. "Sophia, look at me," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. "This is not your fault. This is the Torinos punishing anyone who might have information about what happened. They would have done this whether you'd warned me or not." "But Marco," I started to say, thinking about the man whose nervous conversation had saved Dante's life and possibly ruined his own, "is alive because they need him to recover and tell them what he knows," Dante finished. "If you hadn't acted, I'd be dead and they'd have killed him anyway to cover their tracks. You saved both our lives that night." The logic of his words made sense, but the emotional weight of seeing the aftermath, of knowing that people I'd worked with were suffering because of choices I'd made, was almost crushing. I'd spent years training to help people, to heal and protect and make things better. The idea that my actions had led to violence, even indirectly, felt like a betrayal of everything I'd worked to become. "I need some air," I said, pulling away from his touch and heading toward the windows that offered a view of Chicago spread out below us like a glittering map. But even the beauty of the city couldn't distract from the knot of guilt and fear that had settled in my chest. Somewhere down there, Lily was going to her classes and worrying about tests and boys, completely unaware that her sister had become entangled in something dangerous enough to make the morning news. Somewhere down there, my coworkers were being questioned by police about a night that had changed everything. Dante joined me at the windows, maintaining a careful distance but staying close enough that I could feel his presence like a steadying force. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken thoughts and the weight of circumstances neither of us had chosen. "I called in some favors," he said finally. "Your sister will have protection around the clock until this is resolved. Discreet protection, people she'll never see but who will make sure nothing happens to her." The words should have been reassuring, but instead they sent a spike of anger through me that was sharp and unexpected. "You did what?" I asked, turning to face him fully. "I made sure Lily is safe," he said, his expression suggesting he didn't understand why I was upset. "It's a precaution, nothing more." Without asking me, I said, my voice rising slightly. "Without discussing it with me first. You just decided to put surveillance on my sister and thought I'd be okay with that?" The confusion on his face was genuine, which somehow made me angrier. In his world, apparently, protection was something that was arranged and implemented without consultation, decisions made by people in power for people who had less of it. "She's your sister," he said carefully, like he was trying to navigate a conversation in a language he didn't quite understand. "I thought you'd want her protected." "I do want her protected," I snapped. "But I also want to be part of the decisions that affect her life. She's not just some asset you can assign bodyguards to without consulting the people who love her." The fight that erupted between us was our first real conflict, and it revealed fault lines I hadn't expected. His instinct to protect through action and control clashed with my need to maintain agency and involvement in decisions about the people I cared about. Words were exchanged that cut deeper than either of us intended. Accusations about trust and respect, and the fundamental differences between our worlds. "You don't understand," I said finally, exhaustion making my voice quieter but no less intense. "I've spent the last 4 years being the person who makes the decisions about our lives. I've sacrificed and struggled and made myself responsible for keeping us both safe and happy and on track for better futures. I can't just hand that over to someone else, even someone who means well." The admission hung between us, loaded with more truth than I'd intended to share. But something about the fight, about the way he'd looked genuinely stricken when he realized how upset I was, had broken down barriers I'd carefully maintained. "I had a boyfriend before," I found myself saying, the words coming out in a rush before I could stop them. "For 2 years, during my junior and senior year of college. David Chun. He started out sweet and protective, always wanting to know where I was and who I was with, always offering to handle things for me, so I didn't have to worry about them." Dante's entire demeanor changed, the anger from our fight evaporating as he recognized the pain in my voice. He moved closer, but carefully, like he was approaching something fragile that might break if handled wrong. "It started small," I continued, surprised by my own willingness to share this story I'd never told anyone, not even Lily. He'd get upset if I made plans without telling him first, or if I spent time with friends he didn't approve of. He said he loved me too much to let me make mistakes that would hurt me. He said I was too trusting, too naive to recognize when people were trying to take advantage of me. The words felt thick in my throat, weighted with years of shame and self-doubt I tried to bury. It was so gradual that I didn't realize what was happening until I was completely isolated from everyone except him. My friends stopped calling because he always had reasons why I couldn't see them. My family started feeling distant because he'd convinced me they didn't really understand our relationship. Dante's jaw was tight with barely contained anger, but his voice was gentle when he spoke. How did it end? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. He pushed too hard, started making decisions about my career, my classes, my future. When our parents died, and I suddenly had to take care of Lily, he wanted me to put her in foster care because he said she was too much responsibility, that she would hold me back from the life we'd planned together. The memory of that conversation still had the power to make my hands shake. David's casual dismissal of Lily's importance, his assumption that I would choose him over my sister, had been the moment I'd finally seen him clearly. I broke up with him that night, I said, but it took me months to feel like I could trust my own judgment again. Months to stop second-guessing every decision I made, to stop hearing his voice telling me I was making mistakes. Dante reached out slowly, telegraphing his intentions before his fingers touched the inside of my wrist. There was a faint scar there, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. A reminder of the night I'd finally stood up for myself and the person I loved most. He gave you this, Dante said, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Not directly, I admitted, but he grabbed my wrist when I was trying to leave, and I pulled away so hard that I scraped it on his watch. It was the first time he'd ever physically tried to stop me from doing something, and it was the moment I realized how close I'd come to losing myself completely. His thumb traced the scar with infinite gentleness, and I found myself leaning into his touch instead of pulling away. The contrast between David's possessive control and Dante's careful consideration was so stark it almost made me dizzy. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for arranging protection without asking you, for making you feel like I was trying to control your choices. That wasn't my intention, but I understand why it felt that way." The sincerity in his voice, the acknowledgement of my feelings without defensiveness or justification, was so different from what I'd experienced before that it almost brought tears to my eyes. In my previous relationship, fights had ended with me apologizing, with me accepting that my feelings were unreasonable or oversensitive. "I know you meant well," I said, "and I know your world operates differently than mine. I just need to feel like I have a say in what happens to the people I love." "You will," he promised. "From now on, any decisions that affect you or Lily, we make together. But I need you to understand that protecting you isn't about control for me. It's about the fact that I can't stand the thought of you being hurt because of choices I've made." There was something raw in his voice, a vulnerability that made me look at him more closely. The careful mask he usually wore had slipped, revealing something deeper and more complex than the confident protector I'd been seeing. "Tell me," I said softly. "Tell me about your choices." For a moment, I thought he might deflect, might rebuild those walls, and change the subject to something less personal. But then he sat down heavily on the couch, and I could see him making the decision to trust me with something important. "I was 16 when my father was murdered," he said, staring out at the city beyond the windows. "Shot 3 times in the chest while leaving a restaurant where he'd been meeting with associates. I was supposed to be with him that night, but I'd begged off to go to some party with friends from school." The pain in his voice was so profound that I found myself moving closer, settling beside him on the couch without conscious thought. "If I'd been there, maybe things would have been different," he continued. "Maybe I could have warned him. Maybe the extra security would have been enough. Instead, I was drinking beer in some kid's basement while my father bled out on a sidewalk 6 blocks away." "That's not your fault," I said, echoing his earlier words to me. "You couldn't have known what was going to happen." "Maybe not," he said with a bitter smile. "But I inherited his position, his responsibilities, his enemies. At 16, I became the head of a family I'd barely understood. I learned about protection and loyalty and the cost of making the wrong choice by watching people I cared about pay for my mistakes. The weight of his revelation settled between us, and I began to understand the careful control he maintained, the way he anticipated threats and moved to neutralize them before they could develop. He'd been forced into a world of violence and consequences while most kids his age were worrying about college applications. "I never wanted this life," he said quietly. "I wanted to study law, to find ways to help people legitimately. But family is family, and when your father dies, you become responsible for everyone who depended on him. You learn to be good at things you never wanted to be good at. Like protecting what matters to you, I said, remembering his earlier words. Like protecting what matters to me, he agreed, turning to look at me with those remarkable green-gray eyes. And you matter to me, Sophia, more than you should after 3 days, more than is probably smart given our circumstances. But I can't change how I feel, and I won't apologize for wanting to keep you safe. The honesty in his voice, the admission that his feelings had developed as quickly and unexpectedly as mine, sent warmth through my chest that had nothing to do with the sun streaming through the windows. When he reached for my hand, I let him take it, let him interweave our fingers in a gesture that felt natural despite everything that should have made it complicated. We sat like that for a long time, holding hands and processing the emotional weight of everything we'd shared. The television continued its coverage in the background, but it felt distant and less immediate than the man beside me, and the way his thumb traced gentle patterns across my knuckles. The call that changed everything came just as the sun was setting, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and amber. Dante answered his phone with his usual efficiency, but I could see his expression darkening as he listened to whoever was on the other end. When he hung up, he was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing how much to tell me. "What is it?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "They found your apartment," he said finally. "The Torinos. They tore it apart, looking for anything that might tell them where you've gone or who you might have talked to." The news hit me like a physical blow, but it was his next words that truly scared me. "They left photos," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Pictures of Lily at school, at her dorm, walking across campus. A message that they know exactly where to find her whenever they choose." The rage that transformed his features was unlike anything I'd ever seen, controlled but absolutely lethal. The gentle man who'd shared his painful history, who'd held my hand while we processed our mutual attraction, disappeared behind something much more dangerous. "They want me to know they're serious," he said, his voice quiet in a way that was somehow more frightening than if he'd been shouting. "They're trying to make me desperate enough to do something stupid." "But you won't," I said, though it came out like more of a question than a statement. When he looked at me, I saw the careful calculation behind his eyes, the way he was measuring options and consequences with the kind of cold precision that came from years of making life-and-death decisions. "No," he said finally, "I won't do something stupid, but they just made this personal in a way they're going to regret." The promise in his voice should have frightened me. Instead, as he pulled me closer and I felt the solid warmth of him against my side, I found myself trusting that whatever came next, we would face it together. The vulnerability we'd shared, the truths we'd told each other, had created a bond that felt stronger than the circumstances that had brought us together. When I fell asleep against his shoulder hours later, his arms around me and his voice murmuring quiet reassurances that everything would be all right, I felt safer than I had since the night I'd handed him that warning note. Outside the windows, Chicago glittered in the darkness, beautiful and dangerous and full of people who wanted to hurt us. But inside our temporary sanctuary, with Dante's heartbeat steady beneath my cheek and his promise to protect what mattered to him echoing in my mind, I finally understood that some risks were worth taking, even if they changed everything. A week into what had started as a temporary arrangement, I was beginning to understand why people fell in love with the wrong man. Not that Dante was wrong, exactly, but he was complicated in ways that should have sent me running, dangerous in ways that should have made me keep my distance, powerful in ways that should have intimidated me into silence. Instead, I found myself looking forward to our morning conversations over coffee, to the way he'd ask about my day even though we'd spent it together, to the careful way he'd brush his fingers against mine when he handed me a book or a glass of wine. The routine we'd fallen into felt surprisingly natural for something born out of crisis. He worked from his home office most mornings, handling business calls in low, authoritative Italian, while I read nursing journals and tried to keep up with my coursework online. Afternoons were spent talking, sharing stories about our childhoods and dreams and the books we'd loved. Evenings were quiet dinners and comfortable silences, the kind of domestic intimacy I never experienced, even in relationships that had lasted months longer than this one. If it weren't for the armed security in the lobby and the knowledge that people wanted to kill us both, it might have been perfect. I need to get some air, I announced on Thursday afternoon, closing my laptop after struggling through the same pharmacology chapter for the third time. Real air, outside air. I feel like I'm going stir-crazy. Dante looked up from his own work, concern immediately replacing concentration on his features. You know it's not safe, he said gently. I know, I replied, trying not to sound as frustrated as I felt. But it's been a week since I've been anywhere except this penthouse. I love it here, I love spending time with you, but I need to remember what normal feels like, even if it's just for an hour. The internal debate was visible on his face, protective instincts warring with understanding of what I needed. Finally, he nodded and reached for his phone. Give me 20 minutes to arrange security, he said. We can go shopping, maybe walk through Millennium Park. Somewhere public with good sight lines. The relief that flooded through me was out of proportion to something as simple as a shopping trip. But after a week of beautiful captivity, even a supervised excursion felt like freedom. An hour later, I found myself in a situation I'd never experienced and certainly never expected. Shopping with what appeared to be a small army of discreet protection. Dante had arranged for a driver, 2 men who walked casually ahead of us, and another who followed at a distance. To anyone watching, we probably looked like a wealthy couple out for an afternoon, but I was hyper-aware of the careful choreography that kept us safe. Try this, Dante said, holding up a soft blue sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The color matches your eyes. I can't afford this, I protested, though I couldn't deny the sweater was beautiful. You're not buying it, he said with a smile that made my heart skip. I am. Consider it payment for saving my life. The easy way he spent money should have been off-putting, a reminder of the vast differences between our worlds. Instead, watching him pick out clothes for me, with careful attention to what I liked rather than what was most expensive, seeing him negotiate with sales staff, who clearly recognized his importance, I found myself charmed by his genuine desire to spoil me. This is too much, I said as the packages accumulated, but my protests were half-hearted at best. Nothing is too much for you, he replied, the simple honesty of the statement making warmth spread through my chest. The afternoon passed in a haze of gentle normalcy, and by the time we returned to the penthouse, laden with bags and flushed with fresh air and laughter, I felt more like myself than I had in weeks. The stress of our situation hadn't disappeared, but it had receded enough to let me remember that there was joy to be found even in complicated circumstances. Thank you, I said as we set the packages down in his living room. I needed that more than I realized. I know, he said, moving closer until he was standing directly in front of me. That's why we went. The space between us suddenly felt charged with possibilities, the playful energy of the afternoon shifting into something more intense. We've been dancing around our attraction for days, sharing small touches and meaningful looks, building a foundation of trust and affection that was steadily growing into something deeper. I'm falling for you, I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could lose my nerve. I know it's crazy. I know we've only known each other for a week, but I can't pretend anymore that this is just gratitude or proximity or some kind of Stockholm syndrome. I'm falling for you, Dante. His reaction was immediate and devastating. You fell? He said, reaching up to cup my face in his hands. Cara mia, I dove in headfirst the moment you saved my life. I've been drowning in you for days. The endearment, spoken in his mother's language with such tender sincerity, broke down the last of my resistance. When he kissed me, it was with the careful intensity of someone who'd been holding back for far too long, slow and thorough, and full of built-up emotion that made my knees weak. I melted into him, my hands fisting in the front of his shirt as he deepened the kiss, his thumb stroking gently across my cheekbone in a gesture so tender it almost brought tears to my eyes. This wasn't the desperate passion of people thrown together by circumstances. This was something deeper, more intentional, weighted with affection and respect, and the kind of careful desire that came from truly caring about someone. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, He rested his forehead against mine with a smile that was equal parts relief and anticipation. I wanted to do that since that first morning when you looked so beautiful making coffee in my kitchen, he admitted. I wanted you to, I replied, surprising myself with my honesty. What happened next unfolded with the natural inevitability of something that had been building between us for days. There was no rush, no desperate fumbling driven by lust or proximity. Instead, there were gentle questions and careful confirmations, his hands mapping my face like he was memorizing every detail, my fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw as I marveled at the tenderness in his remarkable eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked when my hands moved to the buttons of his shirt, his voice rough with desire but steady with concern. "I'm sure," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in years. He lifted me easily, carrying me to his bedroom with a care that made my heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with physical attraction. The room was beautiful, all soft lighting and expensive linens, but I barely noticed the surroundings because all of my attention was focused on the man laying me gently on the bed like I was something precious. What followed was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Dante made love like he did everything else, with careful attention to detail and genuine concern for my pleasure and comfort. He took his time, learning what I liked, checking in with whispered questions and gentle touches that built anticipation to an almost unbearable level. When he finally moved over me, his weight settling between my thighs in the most natural way imaginable, I felt complete in a way I'd never expected. This wasn't just physical connection, though the chemistry between us was undeniable. This was emotional intimacy expressed through touch, trust made manifest in vulnerability, affection deepened into something that felt permanent and precious. "I love you," he whispered against my throat as we moved together. The words so quiet I might have imagined them, if not for the way his arms tightened around me. "I love you too," I replied without hesitation, surprising myself with how easily the admission came. The confession seemed to undo something in both of us, removing the last barriers between desire and fulfillment. When release finally claimed us, it was with intensity that left us both shaking, clinging to each other like anchors in a storm of sensation and emotion. Afterward, as we lay tangled together in sheets that smelled like expensive detergent and something uniquely him, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since childhood. His hand traced lazy patterns on my bare shoulder while I listened to his heartbeat slow to normal. And for the first time in a week, I wasn't thinking about danger or complications or the impossibility of our situation. "I love you," he said again, this time with the confidence of someone who'd already heard the words returned. "I love you too," I replied, turning my head to press a kiss to his chest. Is that terrible? Falling in love with someone I've known for 7 days? "Time doesn't matter," he said, his fingers combing gently through my hair. "Some people spend years together and never really see each other. You saw who I really was from the moment you handed me that note." We talked quietly as the sun set outside his windows, sharing the kind of intimate conversation that follows physical intimacy, learning new things about each other despite the hours we'd already spent talking. I told him about my dreams of working in pediatric nursing, about the way children's resilience inspired me. He told me about the charitable foundation his family ran, about his hope that he could eventually transition away from the darker aspects of his inherited responsibilities. The future felt possible in a way it hadn't since that first night, and when I fell asleep in his arms, I was already imagining what it might look like to build a life together once the current crisis resolved. I should have known that happiness that pure couldn't last. The phone rang at 6 in the morning, shattering the peaceful bubble we'd created. Dante answered with the efficiency of someone accustomed to early emergency calls, but I could see his entire body tense as he listened to whoever was on the other end. When he hung up, he was already reaching for his clothes, his face set in grim lines that made my stomach clench with dread. "What is it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "The Torinos have Lily," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "They took her from her dorm room 2 hours ago." The words hit me like a physical blow, driving all the air from my lungs. Everything else, the beauty of the night we'd shared, the love we'd confessed, the future we'd been imagining, disappeared behind the stark terror of knowing my sister was in the hands of people who'd already proven their willingness to use violence. What do they want? I asked, though I already knew the answer. You, he said simply. They want to exchange you for her. One Romano sister for another. The rage that transformed his features was unlike anything I'd seen before. Controlled, but absolutely lethal. These people had threatened what mattered most to both of us, and I could see him calculating responses with the kind of cold precision that spoke to years of experience with exactly this kind of situation. There has to be another way, he said, more to himself than to me. I don't trade innocent lives, and I sure as hell don't trade yours. But even as he said it, I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, the careful consideration of options and outcomes that came with being responsible for other people's safety. No, I said, the decision crystallizing in my mind with perfect clarity. I'm going. Whatever they want, however they want to do this, I'm going to get her back. Absolutely not, Dante said immediately. It's a trap, Sophia. They have no intention of letting either of you walk away from this alive. Maybe not, I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. But she's innocent. She doesn't deserve to pay for choices I made. If there's a chance I can save her, I have to take it. The argument that followed was our most serious yet, with him using every logical argument about traps, scenarios, and negotiation strategies, while I remained focused on the single truth that mattered. Lily was in danger because of me, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to save her. You don't understand, he said finally, desperation creeping into his voice. I just found you. I just admitted I love you. I can't lose you now, especially not to something this stupid and reckless. And you don't understand that she's been my responsibility for 4 years, I replied, my own voice breaking slightly. I made every major decision in my life based on what was best for her. I've sacrificed relationships and opportunities and dreams to make sure she was safe and happy and had the future she deserved. I can't abandon her now just because I've found something good for myself. The pain on his face was almost unbearable, but I could see the moment he recognized the futility of trying to change my mind. This wasn't a decision I was making lightly or emotionally. This was who I was at my core, and he understood that even if he hated it. I'm not asking for your permission, I said gently. I'm telling you that I'm going to save my sister. The only question is whether you'll help me figure out how to do it as safely as possible. For a long moment, he just looked at me, and I could see him processing the reality that the woman he loved was about to walk into a situation that would almost certainly end with her death. When he finally nodded, it was with the resigned acceptance of someone who understood that some choices were too fundamental to argue with. Okay, he said quietly, but we do this my way, with my people, and with every possible precaution. If you're going to be reckless, at least let me help you be reckless intelligently. The relief that flooded through me was immediate and overwhelming. I'd been prepared to face this alone if necessary, but having his support, his expertise, his resources behind me made the impossible seem merely dangerous. As we began to plan what might be the last day of our lives, I try not to think about the future we'd imagined the night before, about the love we'd finally admitted, about all the mornings we might never share. Instead, I focused on Lily, on getting her home safely, on making sure that whatever happened to me, she would be free to live the life I'd always wanted for her. Some choices, I was learning, were more important than happiness, even when happiness felt like everything you'd ever wanted. The war room in Dante's building was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of the dark, smoke-filled space from movies, it was a clean conference room with state-of-the-art technology and men in expensive suits who looked more like corporate executives than what I'd imagined organized crime enforcers would be. But the weapons laid out on the polished table told a different story, as did the cold efficiency with which Dante's people discussed entry points and extraction routes like they were planning a business merger instead of a rescue operation that could end with all of us dead. Marcus, Dante's second-in-command, was a surprisingly young man with intelligent eyes and the kind of calm competence that suggested he'd done this before. He'd been laying out building schematics for the last 20 minutes, marking positions and timing with military precision. The warehouse is isolated, which works in our favor. He was saying, his finger tracing routes on what looked like architectural blueprints. 3 access points, but the main floor is wide open with minimal cover. They'll have Lily positioned to be visible but protected, probably center stage to make sure you can see her when you walk in. And they'll have shooters positioned here, and here, added Tony, another member of Dante's inner circle, marking positions on the diagram. Standard setup for this kind of exchange. They want you to feel exposed and vulnerable. Dante had been quiet through most of the planning, his attention focused on the details with the kind of intense concentration I'd learned to recognize. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried an authority that made everyone in the room straighten slightly. "I want 3 teams," he said. "Marcus takes point with the north entrance, Tony handles south, and I go in the main entrance with Sophia. Timing has to be perfect, because once they see me, they'll know something's wrong with their plan. I'm not just walking in as bait," I interjected, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "If I'm doing this, I'm doing it as part of the plan, not as a helpless victim." The room went quiet, and I could feel the weight of their attention. These men were clearly accustomed to taking orders from Dante and following plans they developed without input from outsiders, especially civilians who had no experience with violence or tactical operations. "Sophia," Dante said gently, "you're not trained for this. The best way you can help Lily is by letting us handle the dangerous parts while you provide the distraction they're expecting." "No," I said firmly, standing up from my chair to face him across the table. "I've spent the last week learning about your world, understanding the risks and the stakes. I'm not some delicate flower who needs to be protected from reality. If I'm walking into that warehouse, I'm going in with a plan and a way to protect myself." The silence that followed was loaded with tension, and I could see Dante weighing his protective instincts against his growing understanding of who I really was. Finally, Marcus cleared his throat. "She could wear a wire," he suggested carefully. "Give us audio on what's happening inside, and she could signal if something goes wrong before we're in position." "And body armor," added Tony, apparently warming to the idea. "Concealed under her clothes. It won't stop everything, but it might give her a chance if things go sideways before we can intervene." Dante's jaw was tight with barely contained frustration, but I could see him recognizing the logic of giving me more than just hope to rely on. "You're not going in unarmed," he said finally. "You'll take a backup weapon, something small that you can conceal easily." "I don't know how to shoot," I admitted. "Then you'll learn," he replied grimly. "Tony, set up something in the basement range. She's got 2 hours to get comfortable with basic operation and safety." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of preparation that felt surreal and practical at the same time. Learning to handle a small pistol, practicing drawing it from the holster concealed at my waist, running through scenarios where I might need to use it. The weight of the weapon felt foreign against my body, but there was something reassuring about having more than just faith and desperation to rely on. The body armor was thin but substantial, designed to be worn under normal clothes without creating an obvious outline. It felt heavy and restrictive, but Marcus assured me that the protection it offered was worth the discomfort. The wire was the most sophisticated piece of equipment, a tiny transmitter that would let Dante's team hear everything that happened in the warehouse. Knowing that they would be listening, that I wouldn't be completely alone even when I was surrounded by enemies, made the upcoming confrontation feel slightly less impossible. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, I found myself standing at the windows of Dante's penthouse one last time. In a few hours, either Lily and I would be safe and this nightmare would be over, or we'd both be dead and nothing else would matter. "You don't have to do this," Dante said quietly, appearing beside me with the kind of careful movement that suggested he was fighting every instinct he had. "Yes, I do," I replied, not turning away from the view. "She's my sister. She's my responsibility. I can't live with myself if I don't try to save her. And I can't live with myself if I lose you," he said, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. I turned to face him then, taking in his remarkable green-gray eyes and the strong line of his jaw and the way he looked at me like I was something precious he was about to lose. In a few hours, we'd either have our entire future ahead of us, or we'd have nothing at all. Then help me make sure that doesn't happen, I said, reaching for his hand. Help me get her back so we can all go home. The kiss he gave me then was desperate and tender and full of everything we might not get the chance to say later. When we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine with a shaky breath. I love you, he said, like the words were a promise or a prayer. I love you too, I replied. Come back to me, okay? The warehouse district at night was exactly as desolate as I'd expected. All empty streets and abandoned buildings that created perfect conditions for the kind of business nobody wanted witnessed. Our convoy of 3 cars moved through the darkness with practiced stealth, headlights cutting through shadows that seemed to hide countless possibilities for ambush. The building where the exchange was supposed to take place squatted at the end of a dead-end street, like something out of a nightmare, its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls speaking to years of abandonment. But the light spilling from the main entrance and the cars parked strategically around the perimeter told a different story about tonight's activities. Remember, Marcus said through my earpiece as our car came to a stop 50 yards from the entrance. You're not alone in there. We'll be in position within 3 minutes of your entry, and we'll have eyes on you the whole time. I can do this, I said, as much to convince myself as to reassure the team. You can do this, Dante agreed, his voice tight with controlled fear. Just remember that getting Lily out safely is the priority, not being a hero. Let us handle the shooting when it starts. The walk to the warehouse entrance felt like it took both forever and no time at all. Each step echoed on the cracked asphalt, and I was hyper-aware of the weight of the body armor under my jacket and the unfamiliar feeling of the concealed weapon against my hip. The wire transmitted everything, including my own rapid breathing, to the team positioning themselves around the building. The main door was heavy and industrial, the kind that required real effort to open. When I stepped inside, the space beyond was exactly what Marcus had predicted. Vast and open, with concrete floors and soaring ceilings that made every sound echo. Bright lights had been set up in the center of the space, creating a harsh circle of illumination surrounded by shadows that could hide anything. And there, tied to a chair in the middle of that circle, was Lily. Even from a distance, I could see that she was terrified but unharmed, her dark hair falling around her face as she struggled against restraints that looked professional and secure. When she saw me walking through the entrance, her eyes went wide with a mixture of relief and fresh fear. "Sophie," she called, her voice echoing in the vast space. "Don't. It's a trap." "Of course it's a trap," said a voice from the shadows, and Vincent Torino stepped into the light with the kind of confidence that came from holding all the cards. "But it's a trap that's going to solve several problems at once." He was older than I'd expected, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and expensive clothes that couldn't quite disguise the violence that radiated from him like heat. Behind him, 3 other men emerged from concealed positions, all of them armed and positioned to control the space around Lily and me. "You must be the little bartender who thought she could save Dante Romano," Vincent continued, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that made my skin crawl. "I have to admit, I'm impressed. It takes real stupidity to get between a Romano and a bullet." "Let her go," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "She has nothing to do with any of this." "Oh, but she does now," Vincent replied with a smile that held no warmth. "She became relevant the moment you decided to play hero. Just like you became relevant the moment you saved a life that should have ended a week ago." He walked closer, and I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the way he was assessing me for weaknesses and angles of attack. This wasn't just about eliminating threats to his organization. This was personal, driven by the kind of ego that couldn't tolerate being outmaneuvered by someone he saw as insignificant. "Your boyfriend thinks he's so clever, sending you in here while he positions his people around the building," Vincent said, apparently aware of more than we'd anticipated. "But what he doesn't realize is that this warehouse has been in my family for 30 years. I know every entrance, every hiding spot, every angle of attack he might try. My blood ran cold as the implications of his words sank in. If he knew about Dante's plan, if he'd anticipated the rescue attempt, then everyone I cared about was walking into exactly the kind of trap Dante had been trying to avoid. That's right, little hero, Vincent continued, reading the fear on my face. Your precious Dante is about to learn what happens when you underestimate the Torino family. But don't worry, you won't have to live with the guilt for very long. The sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere outside the building, sharp and violent, and completely at odds with the careful planning we'd done. Through my earpiece, I could hear shouting and the kind of organized chaos that spoke to a plan falling apart in real time. "Marcus, report," came Dante's voice, tight with controlled urgency. "North entrance is compromised," Marcus replied, his voice strained with effort. "They were waiting for us. Tony's team is pinned down, and we're taking heavy fire." Vincent's smile widened as he watched my face process the reality of our situation. He'd outmaneuvered us completely, turning our rescue attempt into exactly the kind of trap Dante had been trying to avoid. But as I stood there listening to the sound of battle outside and watching Lily struggle against her restraints, something shifted inside me. I'd spent a week learning about Dante's world, understanding the stakes and the violence and the way people like Vincent used fear as a weapon. But I'd also spent that week learning about courage and protection and the way love could make people willing to risk everything for what mattered most. "You made one mistake," I said, taking a step closer to Vincent despite every survival instinct screaming at me to run. "Oh," he asked, apparently amused by what he saw as bravado from someone in no position to make threats. "You assumed I came here to be rescued," I said, my hand moving slowly toward the concealed weapon at my waist. "But I didn't come here to wait for Dante to save me. I came here to save my sister." The moment I drew the pistol, everything changed. Vincent's men reacted instantly, but I was already moving, diving toward Lily's chair while pulling the trigger in the center mass shots Tony had drilled into me during our crash course in basic marksmanship. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space, and I could taste concrete dust and gunpowder as bullets chipped the floor around me. But the body armor did its job, absorbing impacts that would have dropped me while I worked frantically to cut through the ropes that held Lily captive. The cavalry arrived in the form of Dante and his remaining people, bursting through entrances Vincent hadn't been able to cover with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke to years of working together. The firefight that followed was brief and decisive, professional operators against thugs who'd relied too heavily on surprise and positioning. When the shooting stopped, Vincent Torino was dead, and his people were either dead or fleeing into the Chicago night. But the victory came with a price that made my heart stop. Dante was on the ground, blood spreading across his white shirt from a wound in his shoulder that was pumping crimson with each heartbeat. He'd taken a bullet meant for me, throwing himself between Vincent's last desperate shot and my unprotected head. "No, no, no," I said, dropping to my knees beside him and immediately applying pressure to the wound with hands that should have been shaking but were surprisingly steady. 4 years of nursing school and countless hours of clinical training had prepared me for this moment, even if I'd never expected to use those skills on a man I loved. "Sophia," he said weakly, his remarkable green-gray eyes finding mine despite the pain and blood loss. "Are you hurt? Is Lily safe?" "We're fine," I replied, using my jacket to create a more effective pressure bandage, while Marcus called for emergency medical support. "You saved us. You saved both of us." "Good," he said with a smile that was pale but genuine. "That's what I do. I protect what matters to me." The paramedics arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and the ride to the hospital passed in a blur of medical terminology and urgent voices as they worked to stabilize him. I rode in the ambulance holding his hand, using every piece of knowledge I'd gained in school to monitor his vital signs and reassure myself that he was going to survive. Lily met us at the hospital, having been checked by paramedics and cleared of any serious injuries. She was shaken and confused and full of questions I couldn't begin to answer, but she was alive and safe, and that was all that mattered. The surgery to remove the bullet and repair the damage took 3 hours, during which I paced the waiting room like a caged animal and fielded concerned calls from Dante's people who wanted updates on their boss's condition. Marcus stayed with me through the entire ordeal, providing steady reassurance and handling the practical details that needed attention. When the surgeon finally emerged to tell us that Dante was stable and expected to make a full recovery, I felt my knees go weak with relief that was almost overwhelming. "He's awake and asking for you," the doctor said with a tired smile. "Room 314, but don't stay too long. He needs rest." I found him propped up in a hospital bed that looked too small for his frame, his left arm in a sling, but his eyes alert and focused on the door like he'd been waiting for me to appear. The sight of him alive and conscious and essentially whole made tears spring to my eyes before I could stop them. "Hey," he said softly as I approached the bed. "Come here." I settled carefully into the chair beside him, mindful of his injuries, but needing to be close enough to touch him to confirm that he was really going to be all right. "You scared me," I said, taking his uninjured hand in both of mine. "I scared myself," he admitted. "For a minute there, I thought I wasn't going to get the chance to tell you something important." "What?" I asked, though part of me already suspected where this conversation was heading. "Marry me," he said, the words simple and direct and completely unexpected despite everything we'd been through. "I know it's fast. I know we're still figuring out how to make this work, but I can't lose you. I won't survive it." The proposal should have been shocking, should have required careful consideration and long discussions about compatibility and practical concerns. Instead, looking at this man who'd taken a bullet to protect me, who'd arranged for my sister's safety before I'd even asked, who'd shown me what it felt like to be cherished and protected and loved without conditions, the answer was simple. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Yes, but only if you promise no more getting shot." The laugh that escaped him was weak, but genuine. "I'll do my best," he said, bringing our joined hands to his lips. "But I can't promise to stop protecting you. That's not negotiable." "I wouldn't want you to stop," I replied, leaning forward to kiss him gently. "Just maybe with less bleeding next time." The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Vincent Torino's operation and his plans for eliminating the Romano family's influence in Chicago. With him dead and his organization scattered, the immediate threat to our safety was over. Dante's people worked with federal authorities to clean up the remaining loose ends, and within a month, life had settled into something that resembled normal. 6 months later, standing in the bridal suite of a small church on Chicago's north side, I looked at my reflection in the mirror and marveled at how much had changed since that night at Velvet Room. The woman looking back at me was still recognizably Sophia Martinez, but she was also someone stronger, more confident, more certain about what she wanted from life. The wedding dress was simple and elegant, chosen more for comfort than drama, because we'd wanted this day to be about commitment and family rather than spectacle. Dante and I had planned an intimate ceremony with just our closest friends and family, the kind of celebration that focused on the promises we were making rather than the performance of making them. "Are you ready?" asked Lily, appearing in the doorway with a smile that was radiant with happiness. She'd fully recovered from her ordeal and had thrown herself into wedding planning with the enthusiasm only a 19-year-old sister could manage. "I'm ready," I said, meaning it more than I'd ever meant anything. The ceremony itself was perfect in its simplicity. Dante stood at the altar looking impossibly handsome in a charcoal gray suit that brought out his remarkable eyes, and when I walked down the aisle toward him, I felt like I was walking toward my future rather than away from my past. The vows we'd written were personal and honest, acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had brought us together while promising to build something lasting and beautiful from the foundation of trust and love we'd discovered. When he slipped the ring on my finger, his hands were steady and sure, and when I did the same for him, I felt the weight of commitment settling around us like a blessing. "You may kiss the bride," said Father Martinez, who'd agreed to officiate despite some reservations about Dante's background that had been overcome by his obvious devotion to both me and my family. The kiss that sealed our marriage was tender and full of promise, And when we broke apart to face our small gathering of family and friends, I felt complete in a way I'd never expected to find. The reception was held at Dante's penthouse, the same space where we'd fallen in love, now transformed with flowers and soft lighting and the kind of elegant simplicity that spoke to expensive taste applied with restraint. Our guests were an interesting mix of Dante's associates, my nursing school friends, and Lily's college roommates who were clearly fascinated by the entire situation. I graduated from nursing school 3 weeks earlier and had already been offered a position in the pediatric ward of Children's Memorial Hospital, a job that would let me pursue my dream of helping heal children while working for an institution that Dante's Family Foundation supported generously. The synchronicity felt like a sign that we were building something that honored both our worlds. As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, I found myself standing at the windows that had become familiar over the months of living here, watching Chicago glitter in the darkness while wearing a wedding dress and feeling more content than I'd thought possible. Dante appeared beside me, his arms settling around my waist with the careful consideration he still showed for physical affection, even months after his injury had fully healed. "Any regrets?" he asked, pressing a kiss to my temple. "None," I said, leaning into his warmth. "You?" "Just one," he said, and I turned to look at him in surprise. "What?" "I wish I could go back and thank that kitchen worker who gave you the information to save my life," he said with a smile that was soft with memory. "Without him, none of this would have happened." I'd thought about Marco many times over the past months, about the man whose careless conversation had set everything in motion. According to Dante's sources, he'd recovered fully from his injuries and had been relocated with his family to a city where the Torino organization had no influence. His medical bills had been paid by an anonymous donor, and he'd received a job offer at a restaurant whose owner happened to be a friend of the Romano family. "Maybe someday," I said, "when enough time has passed and it's safe for everyone involved." "Maybe," Dante agreed, then turned me in his arms so I was facing him fully. "Mrs. Romano." The name still sounded surreal, but wearing it felt as natural as breathing. "Mrs. Romano," I repeated, testing the way it sounded in my own voice. "I love you," he said, the words as certain and strong as they'd been that night in the warehouse when we'd both thought we might die. "I love you too," I said, standing on my toes to kiss him properly. "Thank you for saving my life." "Thank you for saving mine first," he replied against my lips. Outside the windows, Chicago sparkled with millions of lights, each one representing someone's life, someone's story, someone's choices that had led them to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been one of those anonymous lights, serving drinks and studying for exams and trying to build a safe, predictable future for myself and my sister. Now I was part of something larger and more complex and infinitely more rewarding than anything I'd planned. I learned that sometimes the most important choices were the ones that felt impossible, that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances, and that protecting the people you cared about was worth any risk. As Dante and I danced to music that drifted softly through the penthouse, I thought about the note I'd written on that cocktail napkin 6 months earlier. "Don't drink it. Act normal and leave." For words that had changed 2 lives completely and led to a love story neither of us could have imagined. What would you do if you witnessed someone in danger? I found myself wondering as we swayed together in the soft light of our wedding night. Would you have the courage to get involved, even knowing it might cost you everything you'd worked for? Comment below and tell me about a time you had to choose between staying safe and doing what was right, because sometimes the most dangerous choice turns out to be the one that saves your life in ways you never expected.